Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 214. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Don Silver about his latest coming-of-age thriller, Scorched. Jonas Shore had a difficult home life as a teenager in the 1970s. After his father's unexpected death when he was just 15, Jonas began selling drugs in order to support himself and his mother. But it wasn't long before he's caught and sent to a boarding school for fatherless boys. At that school, Jonas and his roommates were involved in a violent altercation that resulted in a man's death. 20 years later, his childhood actions come back to haunt him, and he is forced to deal with his complicated past. Scorched is Don's second novel. His first, Backward-Facing Man, explores similar themes of family relationships and carrying past actions and choices with us as we age. Don came to writing later in life after a career as a musician, talent scout, and record producer. But he admits that writing stories is something he has wanted to do since he was a kid. In this episode, I'll chat with Don about his writing journey, how his experience as a musician has helped him as a writer, and why he believes creating a good narrative is much like creating a music solo, as well as a few other things coming up. Don Silver, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Hi, Stacey. Nice to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new book titled Scorched. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Well, Scorched is a coming-of-age story set in the 1970s that jumps about 20 years forward and becomes more of a thriller when the consequences of the main character's childhood come back in a rather big way and threaten to destabilize his life. What inspired me to write it was, oddly enough, I have a very good friend I've had since I was in grade school who's always been feeding me ideas for stories and novels. Most of them have been laughably bad, and we have good laughs about it. But he came up with one a while ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, that I thought was fantastic. And I started writing it, but he gave me only the premise on which the book would be based. And in order to create the characters that could support such a premise, I created the main characters that have become the people in Scorched. And by the time I got to know the characters really well and had their pasts defined, the premise that he gave me no longer fit. So I was kind of on my own with it. And as many writers will say, the characters sort of dictate where the plot goes. And my main character was very strongly influenced by events that happened to him in his childhood.
Well, let's talk about the main character, because you said you got to know him really before you started writing. So let's do two things. One, tell us a little bit about Jonas, your main character. And then I want to talk about how you went about creating him. How much of it was you creating the building blocks and designing him, and how much of it was him speaking to you, let's say, and telling you about himself?
Okay. Well, Jonas is I guess a brash, outgoing, confused fellow as a teenager who does not get along with his father at all. And that really shapes his early childhood. He has a difficult relationship with his father, and then very early in the book, his father passes away, and he's left with his mom, with whom he does get along, and a difficult situation financially and practically speaking. So he's forced to navigate his way through his adolescence with a kind of adult pressures for financial stability, and for that he turns to selling drugs. So to answer your question, I have very little in common with Jonas, except maybe his sense of humor at times. But I could imagine being that guy, even though my relationship with my dad was really good and my childhood was calm compared to his. And once I had him sketched out, I could imagine him as a friend at that time, and I could inquire in my mind. I could ask him questions, and he would answer in character. I mean, it sounds a little mentally disturbed, I guess, to say this, but you're a writer, and many of your listeners, I'm sure, are writers as well. And once you get going in an imaginative way, that kind of is easier than it may seem.
Yeah, I think most writers would think that's completely normal to have a
Right.
conversation with a fictional
Yeah.
character in your head.
Yeah. Now the spouses of writers might not agree, and I feel for them in a certain way, but it was really very easy once I had this picture of a person to you know, kind of plug and play, just put him in a situation that I would devise and see what he did and said and reacted. And yeah.
And and how much time did you spend with him? Because you basically had two versions of him, it sounds like. The adolescent version from sort of the first part of the story, and then the adult version 20 years later. Did you spend time with them individually, just writing the first section, then writing the second section, or were they both in your head at the same time as you were drafting?
Well, I did write them one at a time. The first section, when I got finished the first section, adolescent Jonas as a character was kind of in resident memory, but the dialogue that I was having with the Jonas that appears in the second half of the book was with a completely different version of him. So I didn't really. It's a good question because now that I think about it, I don't really picture him the same way. So he felt like a slightly different character.
I would say it sounds like almost two characters, even though technically it's the same one for the reader, but to you, probably two different characters.
Yeah, I got to. It was fun because I got to think about how would these things that I created in his childhood and adolescence manifest themselves in midlife. That was a lot of fun and kind of surprising in a way.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that because you touch on kind of two important points. I want to talk about both of them. One is the family dynamic and how much that changed for him early on by this sort of tragic event, and how he was forced to enter adulthood, let's say, much earlier than he might otherwise have had, and what impact that family dynamic had on him going forward. So let's talk about that one first. The other thing I want to talk about is how what he did as a teen came back to haunt him later. But let's talk about the family situation.
Okay. So I imagined him having a very close relationship with his mother and a very difficult relationship with his father. And when his father dies suddenly and unexpectedly, all kinds of feelings arise that are difficult for him to sit with. One of them is tremendous relief and almost glee. And then, as one would imagine, guilt for having that relief and glee. He inadvertently, or I mean, many of us are like our parents, so he is both like the person he loathed, and he loathed the person he loathed. So it was a very complicated event that was made a little easier because I had met my when I was in my 40s, I had met a man who'd lost his dad at around the same age that Jonas did, and his feelings were very complicated. So I was able to picture that aspect of his family dynamic manifesting in middle age. The closeness with his mother, I think, gave him a sensitivity that made it easier for me as the writer being on the sensitive side, I guess, it was easier for me to describe his inner world. And like many people, his inner world was shaped by that family dynamic. His mom has an interesting story. She comes from a different part of the country than Jonas was in. And so there's a little bit of a cultural difference there. So, when we get to midlife, all this family dynamic is kind of baked into the guy that he became. And it manifests in the events in the second half, which are, as I mentioned, are more thriller oriented. The second part of your question, which is what happened and what did he do in his childhood that manifests and threatens his stability later. After his dad dies and he gets in trouble for dealing drugs, he's sent off to a school for fatherless boys, which was something that was a thing in the 70s and isn't quite really a thing now. But at that school, he met four other guys and they became very tight. And they had various adventures that are detailed in this first half. And one of those adventures ended in a tragic um, mishap that was, quite serious. It's very unexpected. I don't want to speak directly about it just in case somebody picks up the book and wants to be surprised. But the manifestations of that, the legal implications of that, rather, are carried forward into the second half. And it becomes a kind of a race to see, do they get away with what happened or do they get nailed for it? And what role do the other guys that he met at the school play?
Let's talk about marrying those two genres, the coming of age story, teens and everything that they're going through. And then also the thriller aspect of, how do you keep the plot going and the pace building and the tension increasing? So, as a writer, was the story always clear in your mind and that tension between character development and sort of the coming of age story, the emphasis on the characters and feelings and how they're growing, and also this tension building aspect of the thriller, always keeping that pace going? Was that an easy balance to achieve as a writer, or were there times when one pulled more heavily in one direction than the other?
It's interesting when you bring it up. It felt like I was writing two different books in a
Mm.
way with the same characters, almost like a regular book and then a sequel to it in some ways. But the plot carried through pretty directly. So the
Mhm.
event that ends the first half is the focal point of the second half. I guess it married these two types of books that I've just loved all my life, which are these literary novels, I guess you'd call them, and coming of age stories, and thrillers, which as a genre, I just love races against the clock, and really well written thrillers have always captured me. So when I finished the first half, it had been great fun, and I felt the tension of this scene that it ended on, and it felt like it would be really fun to write that as a thriller 20 years hence. But it did feel like a second book.
Did you know the ending when you first set out to write this? I know some mystery and thriller suspense writers, they always know the ending before they start.
Yeah.
Others don't and are surprised by what actually happens when they get there. So
Yeah.
where do you fall? Did you know the ending?
No, I'm in the latter group, the seat of
Mhm.
the pants type writer, where I don't know very much of anything when things are starting. And once I get my characters, I try not to write too much until I have characters really clear in my mind. But once I get them, it sounds kind of silly, but I just let them do what they're going to do, and everything they do is a surprise. So the ending, I had no idea what the ending would be. I didn't even know the first half was going to end on this rather violent, difficult event. But it makes it. I should just add that it's so much more fun for me to do that than to outline something. I like to be as excited as I hope a reader will be. I've written a long time and a lot of stuff, and some of it's been okay, but a lot of it just ended up, it's just sitting in a hard drive somewhere. And I've come across this idea that if it's exciting to write, it could be exciting to read. And if it's not exciting to write, it's definitely not going to be exciting to read.
Right, right. Well, I want to talk a little bit about your choice of setting for this book. You set the first part in the 70s. So it seems historical, probably for some readers, some listeners, a long, long time ago, and for others, not so much.
Right, right.
Just yesterday. But what are the challenges of picking a decade like that, time period like that, and what do you have to pay attention to make sure you get it right?
Well, I mean, the brutal truth is that I lived those years, so it really wasn't that difficult for me to get it right.
Mm,
It just took me scouring my memory, and whether it's a blessing or a curse, I remember stuff from a long time ago really, really well.
mm.
And I thought it would be interesting to set it then because it was such a different time. It's profound how much our society has changed in the last 5 years and 10 years, much less in 50 years. But it was a really interesting and different time that I thought would be make interesting reading for someone who didn't live through it and also someone who did.
I want to transition a little bit into talking about your other novel because Scorched, the one we've been talking about, is your second, so your sort of sophomore effort into the novel world. Your debut was called Backward Facing Man. In that book, you've also chosen the historical setting and you investigate some of the same themes in that book. Can you tell us a little bit about Backward Facing Man?
Sure. That book was set in the late 1960s, which is not a time that I have firsthand memory of. But I kind of wish I had known it. I wished in the 70s when I was coming of age that I had been around in the 60s, if no, for no other reason that the music was really good and there was free love and all kinds of experimentation that looked really fascinating to me. And I wanted to learn more about it. So I guess I read a lot of stuff and saw movies and talked to people, older brothers and sisters of my friends, and got a sense of what the counter-revolutionary movement was, I guess, at the time, with the various demonstrations and radical groups against the war in Vietnam. And I created some characters who were in the thick of that movement. And to the extent that it's the same blend, you're right. There's the same blend of a coming of age story and a thriller. This is more of a business kind of thriller and is more it's more money oriented than say a crime. But the novel explores what it was like in 1968 for just some regular people who were caught on the periphery of this very strong revolutionary movement.
So, as a writer, compare and contrast a little bit for me the difference between writing a book set in a period, choosing a historical period, and writing a book in a period that you didn't experience versus writing it in one where you did experience life during that time. What were
Yeah,
the what differences? Which was one easier than the other? Was one more difficult than the other?
I don't recall a level of difficulty changing, but it did require a lot more secondary sources, I guess you'd call it, where I would
Mm.
have to read about things. And um, I really enjoyed that. But there was a lot more of that for Backward Facing Man than there was for Scorched because I could simply recall or Google things that I recalled and just get the background to that. I like research, and particularly for my first novel, I got to research some retired FBI agents
Hmm.
who were on the other side of the struggle against the demonstrators and developed a few really interesting friendships with people who had one guy in particular had been undercover as a student demonstrator for a couple of years, and that just I thought that was fascinating, and that helped inform the characters of the novel quite a bit.
So, what's in store for you going forward? Because I'm curious, you've got two novels that follow similar patterns. You seem to explore similar themes in them, although coming at them maybe for different angles, different time periods. Do you think going forward, your work will be something similar? This combination of exploring characters and their growth and how their actions impact them later on, and also, but also this thriller element, this fast-paced plot.
I do feel drawn to that kind of combination, if such a thing exists as like a literary novel that's kind of a thriller at the same time.
Well, it
And
does now. You've got two of them.
yeah, well, thanks. But and there are some really fantastic practitioners of this. There are
Mm-hmm.
people at top of game like Mick Herron, who has written the Slough House series and several other standalone books, and Michael Connolly and Alan First. There's some great, really terrific writers who've been doing this. So I'm not putting myself here in the forefront of anything, but I do feel like I'd be drawn to writing something that's set more in a contemporary
Mm.
period and would probably be in this part of the country where I live, which is Western North Carolina, which is a fascinating and wonderful place. But I could see doing the same thing where I'm in the inner lives of people and dealing with some propulsive plot elements.
Yeah. Is there a fascination with how characters behave when you sort of turn up the heat on
Oh
them?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm the human condition is so fascinating that I could almost find it fascinating to observe someone doing nothing and just and there are many other writers who have done that and you can tease out some very dramatic elements of that. But putting people under pressure and then seeing how they respond is really fascinating.
You mentioned earlier that you've written a lot. So I'm curious, have you always been a writer? Is this something, writing books like this, is this something you have always wanted to do?
It is something I've always wanted to do ever since I was really little.
Hmm.
I took a pretty strange detour. First, I became a musician in my teens, and then a manager of musicians and a booking agent. And then I worked in the record business. And then when my interest in music started to wane, and my talent, frankly, was not enough to get me to the heights of musical success, I branched into business. And it wasn't until I was in my late 30s that I went back and got an MFA in writing and decided I was going to write novels. And, my first was published when I was in my early 40s. So I really do have a dream job now in that, by day I'm learning to play jazz saxophone. So I'm still back into music and I get to write stories or novels in the late afternoon and evening. So I'm kind of doing the things that really turned me on when I was 8, 10, 12 years old. And that's a great piece of luck, I have to say.
Do you find that being a musician, having such a long background in music, does that impact your writing in any way? In either how you write, maybe the discipline for writing, or how stories come to you, or how you develop the pacing of a story. Do you find that you draw on that experience at all?
Wow, that's a really cool idea to explore. Because in one sense, creating a story or a narrative is like creating a good solo where I mean, the obvious beginning, middle, and end, but you got to create dynamic tension and then resolve that tension in any musical statement that you're making, if you're composing. So, yes, in a very real way, that there's a direct line between those two things, but it takes so long to get enough mastery at either music or writing to be able to do that and make it compelling, I guess, or interesting. Yeah, I think that's why there's I play amateur. I'm a complete amateur in my saxophone playing now, and there's so much writing that just I'll never, never issue. It'll never become like Scorched, where I think I have something that other people would enjoy. So the other part of your question is, yeah, the discipline it takes to to achieve mastery over in music. You have to learn your scales and 12 keys and so forth. I feel the same is required in writing. You really have to know how to turn a phrase, the rules of grammar, of course, but you need to know what the difference between a a cliche that has no life is and a simile that is fresh and really arresting to a reader. It takes a lot of trial and error, doesn't it?
Yeah. 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 Well, do you have other goals for yourself as a writer since you mentioned you're on this journey, still learning, even though you've been doing it for a while? Do you have goals that you've set for yourself as a writer?
Sure, I write a lot of essays, and I'm still someone who enjoys the practice of writing letters to people, and whether they're in email settings or on typed paper. I've been a poet since I was a kid as well, so, and my MFA is in poetry. So I did that in the beginning of the quarantine portion of our pandemic. I was writing poems, a poem a day. Right now, my writing goals are kind of I'm writing essays, and I'm really interested in writing music at this point. So I'm not really I'm not someone who has goals that I'm driving really hard to. I have it's like a wheel of things that every day I might spin the wheel and do something different. Might be saxophone one day, it might be an essay another day, it might be a short story the day after. I like to keep the creative wheel spinning, and my daily activity has to include something where I get to be creative, or I get cranky.
Well, no one wants that, right?
No, no one wants that. And another big goal is I'm a dad, and I have, kids and grandkids, and I like very much to be able to send them along things or see them and help them experience this changing world we're in.
And one way to do that is through your stories, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah. I think the purpose of these essays is probably to, I'll gather them together into a book for my kids and grandkids, book
Oh,
of
very nice.
reflections. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if people want to learn more about you and your books, things you have going on, new releases, that sort of thing, where can they go to find you and that information?
sure. Both books, Backward Facing Man and Scorched, are available online and in bookstores. And I have a website that's just been updated. So that's donsilver.net. And I enjoy corresponding, so I'd be happy to correspond with people through the website.
Excellent. Well, Don, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you
Sure.
luck with Scorched. Congratulations on everything you have accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much, Stacey. I've really enjoyed our chat.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the bookshop at the end of the internet.